Go ahead and get started. We'd like to welcome everybody to the session. I'd like to introduce very briefly David Bull from the University of Southern Queensland. And he's going to talk to us this morning. And I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you, John. Thanks everybody for coming along this morning. I'd like to basically tell you about an Australian study recently undertaken into open educational resources and practices and what's happening in that space across Australia. This was a 2-year study, and it began in 2010 and it really has only recently concluded. The major kind of planned outcome of this work was what is termed the Feasibility Protocol, which is essentially a tool or an instrument that individuals or organisational managers or even sector-wide decision makers might use to determine kind of strategic directions and policy recommendations to advance the open agenda for their own particular environment. This particular research was funded by the Office of Learning and Teaching, which is Australian government education research body, and it was also supported by a collaboration of distance education universities known as DHUB. This particular project was undertaken by 3 partner institutions. It was led by the University of New England under the leadership of a lady by the name of Karina Bossu. A second partner was Mark Brown from Massey University in New Zealand, and I was the third partner from the University of Southern Queensland. The project also had a sort of review group of experts and an evaluator associated with it, and a number of collaborators and critical friends and colleagues made a contribution along the way. It was a 2-year project. The first year was really all about data gathering, and that involved a number of activities. Fundamentally, we began by, of course, searching the literature, gathering a bibliography of publications that were about the OER and OEP activities of recent years. That was followed up with a survey of the various stakeholders across all of the institutions, higher education institutions in Australia. And that was further followed by a number of interviews with a proportion, about 25% of the survey respondents, were followed up by in-depth interviews to add to the kind of data that we had gathered in that regard. Subsequently, we also examined all the intellectual policy documents, intellectual property policy documents of Australian universities to see if any of them had really addressed the open agenda at all, and we fundamentally found that they hadn't. And I think it's only really now that they're beginning to think about the need to have another look at their intellectual property policies. So as I mentioned, essentially at year 1 of the project was data gathering. Year 2 then moved to the analysis of that data that had been gathered and some steps towards the dissemination of the findings. Okay, look, the planned project outcomes were as follows. As I mentioned, a bibliography, an annotated bibliography, around about 100 key references we limited it to about 100 key references. That bibliography can be found at that particular Zotero site. One of the problems with the bibliography on a subject like this is we did this back in 2010, and already, because there's been such a proliferation of publications over the last couple of years, it's almost like become an aged bibliography list within just a short period of time, which is a bit unfortunate, but it's maybe it's a good thing, because it means that the whole open agenda is moving forward very rapidly. We also undertook 4 particular case studies of OER in practice in Australia. As I mentioned, we did an analysis of all the intellectual property policy documentation from right across the country. And late last year, we held a national symposium in Sydney, in Australia, where representatives from most of the higher education institutions around the country came together to have a look at our first draft of a feasibility protocol to give us some feedback on that early draft and their own thoughts about what should kind of go into that and what should be the major considerations. So that was a very valuable exercise in its own right. And of course, the major outcome was the feasibility protocol. Some early findings. I should tell you a little bit about the sampling. When we conducted the survey and interviews, we got a pretty good distribution of representation from most institutions across the country. And we also got a pretty good distribution from senior executives, academics, people involved like technologists and librarians, copyright officers, a fairly wide range, good spread of respondents made up the sample for the data. So we were pretty happy about that. But as we anticipated, we found that most of them rated they were aware of the OER movement, and they rated their knowledge as relatively intermediate. But a very, very small proportion of the respondents had actually used or were using open educational resources in any way or form. One of the problems with a sample like this is that you tend to get respondents who already have some sort of interest or knowledge, instead of like the total population that might be able to respond. So I guess there's some bias in the responses in that regard, which needs to be recognised. What we did find was that most of those people who were using OERs were using learning objects in their learning and teaching. But that there was great enthusiasm amongst the respondents to be more heavily involved in open practices and the use of OERs. Perhaps one of the more significant findings, but not unusual, was that at the time of gathering the data, we found that there were very few institutions that had given any consideration to the strategic plans of the institution in terms of open educational resources and practices. I would suggest that, particularly in the last 12 to 18 months, this has changed fairly dramatically. At the time of gathering the data, it was obvious that very few institutions in Australia had given much thought to this, but it was also pretty obvious that in the US and the UK there was a lot more going on in this space, and that Australia was lagging somewhat behind. But I think with the coming of all the hype around MOOCs and all the press coverage around that, the whole higher education sector got a little bit spooked in Australia, and all of a sudden all the CEOs have been sitting up and saying, we have to do something about this, we're going to have to think about this a bit more strategically. And so I think in the last 12 to 18 months, we're starting to see some movement on the incorporation of open education, the open education agenda in the strategic plans of institutions. Now, the protocol itself is really a kind of model or a tool. We call it an instrument, and essentially it's built upon the data that we collected and analysed, and the current work that's occurring in the field, and essentially it just poses a whole range of questions. It really fundamentally asks whoever is considering the use of OER or OEP, no matter what level you're at, whether you're an individual academic who's just interested in this field, or whether you are a policymaker within your institution, or a CEO, or even if you're thinking in a sector-wide capacity, to think about the opportunities that might be involved. What are the challenges? How do those opportunities and challenges translate into some strategic directions for you as an individual or for your organization, for your particular institution, and in terms of what sort of policy recommendations, what sort of policy changes are going to have to occur in order to implement some of those sorts of strategic directions. So it's primarily designed as a tool to prompt people's questioning. And the final feasibility protocol, which I'll give you the address of at the end of this presentation, provides a whole heap of questions under a range of headings, questions that under each of these four themes of opportunities, challenges, strategic directions, and policy recommendations, essentially to help people not to have to reinvent the wheel, not to have to cover all the questions themselves. We felt this would be a useful tool across the entire sector in Australia, who are now just starting to think about what they're going to do in the open agenda space, and rather than every institution having to come up with their own way of dealing with this, we thought a protocol of this nature, an instrument, a tool of this nature, gives them simply a framework to then consider their own particular situation and future. Out of our data came a lot of the kind of opportunities and challenges that are found across the literature in regard to OER and open educational practices. The sorts of opportunities seem to be, as listed here, increased collaboration is likely as a result within the institution and across internationally. Everybody's in agreement that it's very much use of open educational resources are very well aligned with academic traditions of altruism and sharing of knowledge and for free and so on. One of the real opportunities, as I see it, is that there's a lot of time and duplication of effort that can be seen or can be gleaned from adopting an open agenda rather than a duplication of many things occurring in many different places. Sharing is, of course, a great saving of time and cost. The peer review of open educational resources can, of course, improve the quality of materials and can also help to enhance the quality of teaching and learning generally. A couple more benefits or more opportunities. We feel it has a great potential for use as a catalyst for institutional innovation, particularly if institutions kind of focus on their uniqueness and where they stand relative to other institutions and how they might be able to take that unique position of their own institution and develop some innovation using open educational resources and open educational practices to their particular advantage. So we feel that there's quite a lot of data seem to show us that quite a lot of people felt that OER has the potential to lead to a lot of new teaching pedagogical practices right across institutions. Some of the challenges, of course, we found very wide lack of interest across the sector in creating and using open educational resources. Amongst our respondents, there was real enthusiasm, but across the sector generally, there was a lack of interest and a lack of knowledge, really, about open resources and open practices and how they could be used to advantage. There was also a real concern about copyright and intellectual property policies and the issues surrounding all of that. A lot of that could be stemmed from a kind of lack of knowledge or a lack of full understanding about how existing IP policies could be interpreted in this new open framework. And I think that even with the new licensing, Creative Commons licensing and so on, there's a need for real extensive professional development for for staff right across institutions in terms of how to deal with some of these sorts of issues. There are challenges around the core quality of resources. Quality is also is an issue that always crops up. Bernard mentioned before, we will of course argue that quality is overcome through good peer review of OER. That's a quote here from one of the respondents. One concern is that openness obviously exposes poor practice, and you won't find many people admitting to that concern, but I dare say it is a major concern. A couple of further challenges. Major challenges that, as I mentioned, there's a real lack of institutional policies regarding open educational resources in Australian institutions. It just virtually does not exist at the present time. Leading on from that is a lack of institutional support. The fact that institutions have not really recognised just how broad the movement is and how quickly the movement is growing and is becoming, and the lack of recognition for staff within institutions to be given rewards, incentives, encouragement, support to carry the movement forward on behalf of the institution. So a couple of examples of the sorts of questions that the feasibility protocol poses. At an organisational level, here's a question: is the university encouragement of open educational practices reflected in current university policy? Something for policymakers to consider within their institution, a question for them to ask themselves, match it up with existing policy. No, yes. What do we have to change? How do we have to change policy to make these sorts of encouragements a part of our daily business? And do current employment contracts support the development of content for educational resources? That's at an organisational level. At a project level, the question might be, does the project have the right to release existing content generated by the university as an open educational resources, or is clearance at a higher university level required? I know in my own institution, we can't just produce a product and then decide that we're going to openly license it. We have to get authority from above to be able to do that. We're still paranoid about giving away our intellectual property, or we seem perceived to be giving away our intellectual property. At individual levels for academic staff, do I have the right to release as an open educational resource educational materials that I've developed in the course of my employment? Good question, an important question. It's a question that comes to my desk very often, and it pulls from academics around the university. Hey, I've just produced this really nice video clip, and I really would like to license it, Creative Commons. Can I do that? How will the university react to this? And I usually have to say, well, I can't answer your question. You're going to have to go and check it out with the university's legal officer as to what our position is on this. And another question, more specifically for an individual, might be, what type of Creative Commons or open content license am I going to apply for my work? So look, these are just a couple of examples. I have to say that the final report of this project has not yet been released, and that's because the funding body hasn't yet released it, but it is very close to being released. And what has been released, I got an email just yesterday to say that the actual feasibility protocol has been released as an occasional paper under this web address. So if you'd like to look at the protocol, it's only a very short document. It's in this sort of structure. The fundamental content of the document is questions. Questions for people to ask about the situation that they find themselves in their own institutions. So with that, I'll leave that address up for anyone who'd like to copy it down. I only added this slide this morning. I'll just sort of throw it open to any questions that you might have. Yeah, sure.
I guess there's no mic. Hello. Speaking from, I've done a lot of OER stuff and sort of forlornly had to kind of look round for OER repositories. In my mind, I can't think of Australian universities as having done a lot up until now. Is that how you would kind of... I think of Tasmania is the one that I can think of has something. Or,
Yeah, my own university, Southern Queensland, has probably got more of a track record
yeah, I believe,
in doing things in the open education resource space than any institution in the country. We've been involved since about 2007 when we joined the Open Courseware Consortium. And I think we're the only Australian university that's part of that consortium. Subsequently, we've been pretty heavily involved in the Open Educational Resource University, which was launched in Thomson Rivers the other day. And there are now 4 Australian universities, Wollongong, Tasmania, Charles Sturt and ourselves that are Australian partners in that arrangement. But you're absolutely right. Australia was very slow to get moving in this space. And as I said, we've got a bit of catch up to do, we really have. America and the UK have done so much more and so much further ahead in terms of work in the open space. So we reckon we've got a lot of work to do in the next couple of years to catch up. But the momentum is there now. I think, as I mentioned earlier, that all the hype around MOOCs, all the publicity has really spurred institutions to kind of sit up and pay attention and recognise that they need to start to get involved or start to develop their own agenda.
It's amazing to me that the challenges that have come out of your study are exactly the same as in our country, and I wonder if it's not from the lagging behind. But are there any recommendations that have come out of the study for the implementation, or are you going, because that's what I'm interested in, because we have the same issues in South Africa. We now need to implement it, and that whole copyright thing that you set up, a copyright office where the academics can go. And
yeah, but I think when we started this study, we would have loved to be able to come up with this magic list of recommendations at the end that this is the way we're going to address these challenges, and this is the way we're going to address these problems. But we actually haven't been able to do that. And all we've kind of wound up with is a whole lot of questions and the need for further study and research. Around the intellectual property policy space, I would like to see a further centralised study which made some recommendations, with some real legal expertise involved, so that not every institution around the country has to revisit this and develop their own policy, but there is at least some centralised guidelines which people can turn to and say, hey, this is what's been recommended, do these fit our needs? John?
I'm interested, I know there's benefits for OER for the students and for the instructors, and you mentioned at one point in your presentation that institutions can distinguish themselves from other institutions by using OER, or that they can improve how they compare themselves with other institutions. Could you talk a little bit more about what would that look like? What are some of the distinctions that might be possible for some institutions to use OER in a way that comparing to others makes them somehow improved?
Well, but I think one of the things that institutions are grappling with is a way that they can use open educational resources and practices in a sustainable way, and yet not stray too far from their existing agendas. Now, for instance, certain institutions have specializations. A number of institutions are clearly research dominated, others are distance education providers, others are more traditional face-to-face providers and so on. So I think essentially the idea is to look at the uniqueness of your own institution and say, what are the unique features of our institution? How can we develop some strategic directions under the kind of broad, open agenda of resources and practices, and move forward as a unique kind of branded university in the open space, but promoting our own particular area of expertise. If that's,
Very well.
and I think any one final question, or is that it? That's it. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.